Welcome to our talk with two writers and poets. We're going to be talking on the topic of climate change and lyrics or poetics. I have two guests. The first one is Julia Fiedorczuk, which is on the internet in Warsaw. Next to me is sitting Frank Keizer, a Netherlands-based author and poet. Julia Fiedorczuk, who is right now in Poland, was also born in Warsaw in Poland. She studied literature and she has become a writer, translator, and of course a poet. And her works have been awarded with several prizes. And the very interesting thing is that Julia has also established the first School of Eco Poetics, which we will be talking about later. If you have more interest in that, you can visit the website. And Frank is born in the Netherlands. He has also studied literature and became a translator, writer, and a poet. Also has been nominated for prizes. And Frank is a co-founder of a web-based poetry magazine. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and it's delightful to be here even in this changed way.
Yes, due to Corona, unfortunately, we cannot meet in person, well, at least not with you, Julia. However, thanks for time and effort. We appreciate that you could make it possible, both of you, to be here and talk now. I want to ask you a question about your motivation to focus on ecology while writing or making your lyrics. How did it happen? Why did you decide to write about it? Julia, maybe you could start first.
Well, I think, quite frankly, this is the most important political issue of the time, planetary catastrophe. Because people sometimes speak about climate crisis, but it's not really a crisis, since the word crisis would imply that it's a moment that will pass, yes, and then everything is going to be okay. I don't think that's the case. It's clearly we are living at the beginning of a catastrophe, and this is the most important political issue of our time, which is not being considered as such. Still, it's not universally considered as this crucial political issue. So I think it's quite natural that writers and poets and artists turn to this question, yes, because someone has to deal with the issue that is so fundamental. And also, when you think about poetry, poetry has always relied on experiencing very deeply the relationship that we have with the more than human world, with the non-human world, and the catastrophe changes all that. It's like it changes everything, and it also changes the way that we write, because you cannot write pastoral poetry anymore. Yes, you cannot write a poem that just contemplates, the sea or trees or whatever, without having in mind the fact that it's being destroyed. Yes, that non-human nature is being destroyed at the moment. So I think that it's quite natural that poetry and art reacts to the fact that there's a material change in the world. We simply can't write in the way that poets used to write, in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. So I think intuitively to me, it's quite understandable that it's poetry that reacts with its imagination and with its forms, with its poieses, that it reacts to this radical change that is happening in front of our eyes. Yes, I think that's one way to answer this. The other way to answer this is that I've always, before I even started thinking about ecology, my writing has always been involved in the material world very much. I'm really interested in the relationship between language and the material world. So
So for you, it was a natural process.
Yeah, so it was a natural process, yes.
Frank, how about you? Was there an initial drive for you to start to write about ecology?
Well, maybe I can start the way around. I have always been very interested as well in material ways to look at the world and to write about the world.
Yeah, you have always written about society critical topics.
Exactly. I've always been a political poet, as people say. But I would say that the ecology became a way of articulating this materiality in an even wider constellation of things, people, the whole relationship with, as Julia said, the non-human world. So for me, it was like an intrusion almost at some point that I started considering the sheer catastrophe of what is happening right now, and that it puts pressure not just on the natural world, obviously, but also on our capacity to write about it, and that we urgently need a new language, new forms to think about and to write about this, because it's a complete narrative crisis as well, because the whole idea of the modern world, it's built on progress, and what climate change or climate emergency, I would say, makes clear is that this idea of progress is untenable, and all our narratives are tied up with it. So we urgently need to untie those things. And this became for me the motivation for my writing, and it grew out of an interest in imagining different worlds already, and it's only a natural process to include in that the ecological as a discourse.
Julia, you are not only writing yourself. As I've already said, you have established, you are co-founder of a school, the School of Eco Poetics. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
It's a school which I established together with a friend of mine who is a Polish nonfiction writer whose name is Filip Springer. And now the idea behind this has to do with what Frank just said. And for instance, this idea that our civilization so far has been based on the notion of progress that can go on infinitely, and that can be based on the exploitation of the so-called resources, natural resources. And this idea in itself is a kind of story. It's a kind of story that people have been telling, that this civilization have been telling itself about our place on this planet. Yes, it's a certain story. It's a huge myth that we have created, and that people have believed in for centuries. And so the School of Eco Poetics has to do with looking at such myths, and with looking at also metaphors that we use to imagine, to explain, to interpret our place in relation to the modern human world, to the modern human environment. Because as a lot of people say, the planetary catastrophe or the planetary crisis is, at least in some part, a crisis of the imagination. Yeah? So the idea is to work with the imagination, to see what has gone wrong, and to look at the basic structures of our imagination, and to try to figure out new ways of thinking, new ways of speaking, new metaphors. Metaphor is also a kind of technology. It's a very powerful tool, yes? So the School of Eco Poetics, the poetics in eco poetics is, it comes from the Greek word poiesis, which means, like Aristotle's Poetics explains that poiesis means more or less the same as making. Yes, it's the making of a composition out of elements. Yes, so poetics is how we make things. For example, how we make stories, or how we create meaning, how we create myths, how we make our life. And this eco poetics also involves another word, the word eco, which comes from Greek oikos. It's the same eco as in economy, right? And it means more or less the same as home. Yeah, so this eco poetics is like the making of a home. So the School of Eco Poetics is a school which through various experimental forms aims to work with our imagination when it comes to how we think about our place on this planet. And so we have collected a group of wonderful people who are journalists, because we think it's a very big problem that, you know, the way journalists write about climate change is just not good enough very often, yes, especially in mainstream media. So we have journalists, we have creative writers, we have art photographers, we have even lawyers and therapists. So people who work in the creative domain in various ways, yes. And we have a program which involves a lot of reading, including poetry, of course, because poetry is this powerful laboratory of metaphor. But we don't just read poetry, we read also scientific texts, we also read philosophical texts, political texts, and we discuss these texts, but also we travel, we do a lot of hiking. It all happens in reality, in spite of the pandemic. We, you know, so far we have managed to meet twice, once in Warsaw, and once we went to one of Poland's biggest open pit coal mines to look at the sort of landscape of Anthropocene. And so the school involves reading, discussion, thinking together, but also being silent, also traveling, also hiking, and other forms of practice, and also activism.
That sounds very interesting. But going back to your own poetry, speaking of making poems, you for yourself have chosen the form of psalms. One of your books you have published in 2017 is called Psalms. Why is it that you chose that form? Is there any connection to the biblical language?
Yes, there's actually a strong connection to the biblical Psalms, even though it is also somewhat ironic. This has to do with the fact that I'm kind of interested in ancient books of many traditions. And of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition is the dominant tradition in our part of the world. And the Psalms are beautiful poems. They're interesting. They're also quite cruel. There is a long tradition of translating the Hebrew Psalms into Polish. A lot of Polish poets have translated Psalms into Polish. For example, Czesław Miłosz. So my first sort of fascination with the Hebrew Psalms was through the translations of Czesław Miłosz. Then I started learning Hebrew myself, and reading the Psalms in Hebrew, and even singing the way that some of the Psalms are sung in a synagogue. So I studied these texts in their materiality and in their politics and in their poetics. And I attempted something like a translation, but it's not a translation like from language to language, but it's a translation from an ancient book to a kind of modern, poem in the contemporary world, with the problems that we have now, the social problems, the ecological problems, and a sense of subjectivity that we have now, this late sort of postmodern kind of subjectivity. And it's ironic also a little bit because the speaker in my songs is a woman and a mother, and so that in itself is a kind of ironic shift, because of course the Hebrew poetry or the biblical poetry was masculine, and that is a shift.
That is a very interesting point, because it's obvious that you address or mention the roles of a mother and a daughter. You're speaking very often in your poems of children or a specific child. What exactly are the roles of those two?
I'm afraid it's going to be very simple. I'm a mother and I have a daughter, and you know, I think for many people who have young children, my daughter is already 15, so she's not that young. She's quite a teenager. But I think for many people who have young children, one of the most difficult things about this moment is this really terrible anxiety about, you know, what kind of world are they going to live in? And so for me, I live with this anxiety day and night, all the time. I find it absolutely paralyzing sometimes, you know, the thought of what this planet is going to be in 30 years, in 50 years, when she is, you know, when she grows up. So okay, so I worry about my own daughter, but I use this figure of motherhood to include other children, but also this sort of caring attitude about other beings. So this motherhood is, of course, my personal issue. Yes, I am a mother and I worry about my daughter, and I write from this position because it's my experience. But also I make it into a metaphor of a kind of ethics which is opposed to this capitalist technocratic ethics of exploitation, of, you know, using natural resources. So I try to use this as a basis for this kind of ethics of care and responsibility and love, simply, you know, however you know, naive that might sound. But I think love is powerful, and I think it can be quite radical, actually, politically.
Yeah, you've got a very emotional approach in your work, and it's really perceivable when reading them. Could you tell us a bit more about it? I mean, you use words that are very emotional, like anger, joy, devastation. What does it mean for your work to use those words?
Well, I mean, these are. It's not like I had this project to use a lot of words that address emotions. It's just that I do feel, and I think we all feel, maybe not all, but a lot of us experience very powerful emotions right now, even though sometimes on the other hand, these emotions are somehow repressed or suppressed, so that, you know, life can go on and we can pretend that everything is going to be okay. But the moment you begin to really look reality in the face, the moment you stop sort of escaping, the moment you actually confront the world at this moment, I think it's quite natural that people would feel all kinds of feelings, including anger, because yes, and worry, and sometimes despair. And despair is one of the things that I found in the Psalms, because the Hebrew Psalms, they, when you look at those old poems, there's a combination of two kinds of feelings: a very profound despair and a very unconditional very unconditional affirmation, right, of life. So you have these two sort of seemingly incompatible feelings: despair and anger. And like there are these moments when the psalmist is calling God. Yes, I don't address God, but because my poems are completely secular, but I also address someone, right? The psalmist addresses God, saying, you know, like from the depths of despair, very often saying, you know, de profundis, yes, from the depths of abyss, calling out to someone. And so there's this, but there's also this affirmation of very often non-human nature, joy, yes, and celebration and singing. Singing itself is already a kind of celebration, and so I took this from these sounds, these two kind of seemingly contrasting and maybe incompatible feelings, which I both kind of experience. Yes, I think we also need to have this affirmation and joy, because otherwise we will not imagine a different world. I don't think it would be possible without joy and affirmation.
Okay, thank you. Frank, how about you? What role does emotional language play in your poetics?
Since the start, I've been interested in negative emotions, basically.
That's interesting.
And I would say that's gradually. No, I've never been interested in them per se, but always interested in, let's say, discovering maybe some ambivalence in those negative emotions.
So you could say the topics you choose, like critical society approach, is definitely evolving your language.
Definitely, and but I very much agree with Julia that for me, increasingly so, I would say joy has become a very important part of my poetics as well. Especially joy in remaking the world. Collectively, I would say. So for me, those emotions that I mobilize in my work, they are never only individual. Which is what people maybe associate with poetry. It's about the overflow of individual emotions. I've always been interested in this, let's say, collectively mobilizing aspect of emotion. I always call, I don't use the word emotion so much as affect. So I'm very much interested in how people are moved and how we are moved by each other and moved by things in a more, let's say, on a more pre-individual level. I think this is the stuff of the world. Yeah, quite literally, in this a materialist, almost like Spinoza kind of sense, that we're made of stuff. And that stuff is what actually what the world is made of. And so we have to engage on this level to change the world. So this is for me, let's say, the profound sense of effective, of the effective and the political. They go together. So,
You've once said that your poems are a place to talk and to learn.
Yeah, it's very important for me. Poetry is a space for collective and collaborative learning.
And you've also used the term of ambulant talk. Could you elaborate on that?
Right. This is for me very connected, because when you think of learning, traditionally think of this center of learning that spreads out the information, the knowledge. Right? It's like the idea of the master in the center. And it's kind of educating the rest, the masses. So there's this one individual lecturing or teaching the mass or the student. So there's this hierarchical relationship implicit in learning. I'm much more interested in, let's say, de-hierarchical or anti-hierarchical forms of learning and experiencing. And for me, this ambulant talk, as I call it, is very much part of that. Because this is kind of a way of producing knowledge while going. So without any finished end goal in sight. So within this space of openness. And for me, poems are sites for this open process of learning. I've always been interested in the very conversational, informal aspect of poetry.
However, to do conversations, you need a mutual language.
Yes, and this for me, the poem is this site to discover this mutual language. This is what I try to show, or what I try to not maybe show, but what my poems are. They're basically those processes. So they're not narrating any end goal. It's the process itself that is continually kept going. This maybe sound all very abstract, but this is for me my formal interest in conversation is because of this possibility, this gesture and this affirmation of this collective desire to find this knowledge, this new knowledge in this new language. Yeah.
Do you think this approach, I mean, it changes the way you use your language? Do you think it would also create a new kind of language to communicate with your readers?
I do hope so. At least for me, the poem is this commonplace. This is where
also maybe a political place?
Also, it's definitely a political place, because the commons is in the end, of course, about collective living and how to articulate this.
Julia, how about you? What do you think a mutual, like a global language could look like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I believe strongly in many languages. I strongly believe I believe in conversation very much. I also think of poems as conversations, and of poetry as an ongoing conversation, as something that never exists in a vacuum. I think that's a very, very crucial point, really. And because it always addresses someone, it always listens. I also like this point that poetry is a way to listen, to learn, but also to listen, to open up, to involve silence as a crucial element. And but I also believe strongly in a kind of polyphony. Yeah, so I believe in many voices, in many languages, in many stories, as opposed to one story, or in many languages as opposed to one language. I think maybe poetry does that. Well, not just because we write in many languages like Dutch or Polish or German, but also because people experiment in different ways, and I think that part of the ways in which people experiment, and I think it's so wonderful that people do it in so many different ways. I feel like I meet all these different ways that people experiment and look for new kinds of knowledge, for new forms of knowledge, as Frank said, not only for new kinds of knowledge, but for new ways of knowing, yes, or for new, not just for new meanings, but for new ways to mean something, to express something. So for new ways of knowing. And I do think we need multiple knowledges as opposed to, one kind of knowledge. Multiple knowledges, multiple imaginations, multiple voices. So I believe in this. And I think poetry helps, because it is opposed to a kind of monoculturalism always. I mean, with the exception of, propaganda, yes, because of course you can have the kind of poetry that is state propaganda, but it's not what interests us, yes. Poetry that looks for something and that experiments will always be opposed to a kind of monolingual narrative, which is not opposed to it's being communicative, yes? Because I also believe in poetry being communicative, in its ability to communicate across languages and across borders and across differences. But somehow I do think it works with difference, and it works with communication, and with with opening up this space of conversation. I think it's absolutely crucial. It's not like one common language, but I very much, I love this idea of poetry being the commons, where this is, I think, sort of, I like it politically, this idea that it's the commons, that this is where we go and share, and these new knowledges come into being for everyone to use.
The lyrical voice in your poems is not only human. You have a lot of times non-human voice. How do you create that? How do you give the sun, the trees, the grass a voice?
I don't think I give the trees or the grass a voice. I don't think so. No, I always speak as a human. I try to move beyond, or I try to figure out the ways to move beyond a very narrowly anthropocentric or anthropomorphic way of thinking. But ultimately, I am a human being, and my language is a human language. So I think, I mean, maybe there's one poem which is spoken from the perspective of a beetle in the first person, but that's, like with the awareness that, of course, I'm pretending to be a beetle, yes, because I'm not a beetle, yes, and a beetle would never speak in human language. So I think this is an interesting challenge. How do we incorporate? How do we invite the more than human world to our work? But to me, it's more through form, and it's more through silence. So, okay, I know now how to answer your question. John Cage, an artist whom I like very much, said at some point that he's not interested in the kind of art that is about nature, but he likes the kind of art that imitates nature in its manner of operation. So how do you imitate nature in its manner of operation? What is this manner of operation? So these are, for example, waves and rhythms and patterns and spider webs, and a certain idea of form, but also adaptability. So like when you think about a spider web, for instance, it has to have this perfect balance between a fixed form, because it is a style, it is a poetics. Every spider species has a recognizable poetics, but this poetics has to be adaptable enough so that a spider can actually put this web regardless of the environment. Yes, because if it was too rigid, then the spider would never find the perfect place to put the web, right? So for example, this kind of dynamic balance between form and adaptability. This is the manner of operation. So on this level, this is the level of poetics. So this is what I like exploring. But speaking in the voice of other beings, I think one needs to be careful, because it's very easy to do it in a way where you just sort of colonize. And you say, oh, I speak in the name of, but who gave you the right? The grass never gave me the right. The grass never told me to speak in its name.
Yeah, but see, that's the interesting thing, that we as readers might interpret things you didn't actually mean to be there. And I thought I had read some sounds that you described as being the voice of waves or trees or something. My way of interpretation. But since we're talking about language, how about scientific language? Scientists have been talking about climate change for a while now, and this sort of language didn't work out as well. Why do you think poetry might be a better way communicating about the awareness of climate change?
I'm not sure if it can be a better way, but it can be, but we need always. I mean, we need all kinds of ways. I'm convinced that we need, both science and art and poetry. So I think of poetry and science. My dream is that poetry and science become sort of not in competition with each other, but that they sort of complement each other. Because we clearly need scientific knowledge and the scientific perspective. But the scientific perspective is also limited. It has its limitations. And one of the limitations of the scientific perspective is that it's very difficult to communicate, because people don't understand charts. People look at charts, or they say, I don't believe in global warming, as if it was a question of believing or not believing. So I think we need all kinds of languages, and I also think that part of the problem with this, part of the problem with the imagination that we have in late capitalism, very late capitalism, is this compartmentalization of sensitivity into, for instance, science, and then the arts, and then the so-called humanities and the so-called hard sciences. So like people become specialists in their very narrow fields, and they don't communicate between the fields. So my dream is to have this conversation, yes, between, for example, the arts that introduce a different perspective, the ethical perspective, for instance, and the dialogic perspective, yes, and the science, which gives us knowledge, this fundamental knowledge that we can trust about how the so-called natural world works. So I think that speaking of new kinds of knowledges or new ways of knowing, one of the possible revolutions would be in a way of knowing that somehow integrates these perspectives, and that's my dream. What poetry does is it for people who care about it. Of course, I realize that not everybody cares about poetry. Most people don't, but some people do. I do, and I know, at least a few other people who also do. So one of the things that poetry does, I think, is it makes us like feel part of a community, part of a larger community of human beings, but also more than human beings, like grass and waves, which of course appear in a lot of my poems. I was just saying that they're not speaking, yes. This in itself, the sense of being alive as an element in this network of connections between living beings, human and other, is, I think, very, very important, because if we feel alive in this way, this is when we start to care. And this, combined with what science tells us, I think might produce a new kind of knowledge that we...
Do you think it has the power not only to bring awareness to the people, but also to make them act, to start some sort of activism?
I don't know, but I think a lot of times we do things and we don't know what the result is going to be. I'm telling you honestly, the honest answer to this question is I truly don't know. I hope it translates into something. I do believe that our actions and words are actions and poems are actions, poems are acts. Everything has consequences, yes? Everything has some sort of consequences, but you never know. Like, you write a poem, you never know who's going to read it. You never know who is going to be moved by it and how. As you just said, people have different ways of reading, and that's totally fine. It's part of this dialogic character of poetry. So you can't know. But I think that's part of that's part of the miracle of art, that you can't know in advance what the result is going to be. And that's okay for me. I think even with activism, these days, you can't know exactly what the result is going to be, but that's not the reason not to do it.
Okay.
I guess.
Frank, how about you? Do you consider yourself an activist poet?
No, not particularly, but I think I see myself as a language maker. And I think what poetry can do is aggregate those languages. So to find a way to connect different ways of seeing, ways of knowing. I think this is something that we need. This connecting tissue between all those different kinds of knowledges, which are all important in itself, but have indeed specialized to such a degree that, I mean, this totality that we need to know, which is climate crisis or climate catastrophe, we cannot solve it because we don't know how to connect all those dots. So I think poetry, but not only poetry, but let's say aesthetics, poetics, but also the technical aspect of that, right? So I think this is also important to stress, maybe. The technical aspects of form, making forms and inventing them which is what science does, but also what art does, to bring those together in new ways, and maybe rethink narrative and rethink, because what's narrative? A narrative is also based in myth, right? So science also has narrative. Science is also a narrative practice. So, and I think practice is another important term to consider. I mean, we have to think about knowledge not as a finished end product, but as something we do. And what we do is not just activism, it is also inventing practices, new practices. The practices that we have, they might not be suitable for the times we're now living in. So I think this is something we have to think about, all those connections between those practices. And not think about something at, let's say, a unified perspective, because I don't think that exists anymore. It has never existed, but we pretended that there was this progress narrative that will basically solve everything, which it does not. It's part of the same problem. So the whole narrative that we have is basically part of the problem. So we have to reconstruct that whole narrative and speculate about possibilities outside of those narratives that we know, narratives of progress, narratives of modernity, and maybe center those narratives that are not founded on progress. So I think that's also what poetry can do, is center those stories that have not been part of our knowledge. Maybe stories of non-human stories, or stories of peoples that have been extinguished by progress, indigenous stories. So to bring all those together without recolonizing those knowledges, that is, I think, the main project that we have to take on. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, because you have been writing on how poetry or language in general can help creating ideas, creating alternatives to a world that we maybe now do not imagine, instead of criticizing.
Yes, I think speculative, as I would say, is a more urgent task now than criticizing, because I mean, criticism is of course important, and there are a lot of things that critique can do, but it can also do a lot of things it can't. There are also a lot of things it can't do. So it can describe how we got into this mess, basically, and what are the conditions of the mess, but how to get out of that mess, it's much harder. So we need, let's say, imagination for that, and to speculate not about, what is probable, what we think will happen, but let's say what's possible outside of any of those historical frameworks. So this is why I think this is why I want to construct, basically, or stress that in my work, the constructive and constructivist aspect of it. And it's basically a question of assembling. In terms of science, what's interesting about science, and I take this from Isabelle Stengers, which is Brussels-based philosopher of science. She says, well, what's interesting about science is that facts are propositions because they assemble people around them. And the more people they assemble around them, the more true the fact is, the more true the statement is. So this is a very pragmatic way, in a way, to think about scientific knowledge. But I think it's interesting because of that. So how can we assemble people around those matters of concern? Not matters of fact, but matters of concern. So how do we concern the most people around the issue? This is a very different way to think about objectivity. And I think that's an important new way to think about it, because if we want to gather people around an issue as big as climate change, climate crisis, then we need to have those propositions that can mobilize. Not on the streets per se, but also in terms of thinking. So this whole propositional logic is also very important to me. Okay. And I take it from science in a way. It's a way of looking at science not as this rational producer of truths, but as a producer of practices of doing knowledge. collective practices of doing knowledge. So yeah, that's a way for me to do, to act, and to combine, to connect.
Julia, do you think it's a better approach? Like, do you agree that being critical is not as effective as being constructive in your work?
Yes, I do believe so. I do believe it's also, I also believe that it's more difficult to be constructive than to be critical. Everyone's critical. I mean, the left, for example, in Poland, we have this problem that the left is almost exclusively critical, practically without, you know, a kind of positive vision, which is part of the reason why we have the situation that we have in my country right now. But I also believe that we need to understand the basic mistakes. I think it's important to understand the basic mistakes that we tend to make over and over again, that we take to repeat, including the imaginative mistakes, or the way, you know, the mistakes in thinking. Or I think it's important to realize, for example, that we keep using obsolete metaphors that maybe were useful once. It's like, you know, certain, like myths, for example, were important and good, and they were okay for their time because they explained something to people in effective ways. But they have to evolve. Stories have to evolve. Metaphors have to evolve. The ways of speaking have to evolve. Everything that is alive changes and evolves. Yes, only dead things don't change. So I also think that we have to look at, for example, at the obsolete stories or metaphors that we keep using, and understand that they're obsolete and that they don't work for us, that they are not adequate to this moment. And this is, for me, the first step. And then, of course, comes the really important task of trying to invent new ways of thinking, of relating to the world, of world making and of home making on the earth. And it's a huge project, and I think it's beautiful, and I think it's wonderful. And no matter what the results are going to be, I think it just, you know, an important aspect for me of activism or the kind of work that I do is that regardless of what's going to happen, I think we need to have meaningful lives, you know, the lives that are lived in a certain style also. And so I think this work, you know, thinking about how effective that is. So outside of how effective that is, I think this work is crucial also because it's beautiful.
Yeah, we might also consider that literary forms are obsolete, right? So some literary forms might be obsolete. So we might be maybe we should not attach too much to certain obsolete stories and the way they are connected to our worlds that are increasingly getting more obsolete. So we're still living in this bourgeois-made world, but it's crumbling and crumbling and it's crumbling. But we still write novels about. I don't, but people write novels about, you know, middle-class life, and I don't know. This is something that's just seems so paradoxical to me. So we might have to invent completely new forms that we cannot for our survival, not just for the fanciness of it, but for survival. So that's it's really the stakes are very high. I agree. Because we might need completely new ways of world making to be able to have a world, to live in a world, to inhabit a world.
Julia, you wanted to comment on that?
No, I just wanted to say, I was just saying that that's exactly the question of poetics. Yes, the question of new adequate forms. So, you know, what I've been also trying to articulate about poetics is exactly what Frank is saying. That it's not just about, you know, writing poems in this way or that way, but it's a much deeper kind of work. Yes.
Yeah, it's much more ecological in that sense, because it's about articulating the interconnectedness of beings, and it's not just about the environment as we think of the environment as something that surrounds it. It's much broader material assemblage of humans and non-humans and all those. This whole interconnectedness and how to articulate it. And I think poetics, even going back to the Greek definition, it was always about this. It was always about this very wide materialist way of viewing the world. But they saw matter differently than we do, of course. We have the natural sciences now, but the way they thought about matter was very expansive, at least pre-Plato, pre-Aristotle. So there's this wide body of thought we can rediscover and to use to rethink the relation with the world in a materialist way, in a profound materialist way. And I think this is one of the challenges that this crisis puts to us, is that we have to expand even further this materialism and therefore our poetics. And this needs rethinking everything, basically. And this is
Yep. And that's what both of you do in a very successful way. Thank you so much for being here, for talking to us, for the insight of your thoughts and ideas. Really appreciate, and so does our public. And thanks a lot again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.